Welcome to Stuck in Vermont, brought to you by 7 Days and sponsored by New England Federal Credit Union. My name's Ava Solberger. Today we are in Montpelier at Greenmount Cemetery. We are going to spend the afternoon with cemetery historian Daniel Barlow and meet some of the cemetery's more infamous residents.
These places are intended to be visited, intended to be walked around, and you're supposed to actually look at the stones and read the stones and have realizations about your own mortality.
Yeah, I really love this place because there are a lot of little nooks and crannies and little hidden quiet spots.
The land was donated to the city back in 1854, and what's really interesting about Greenmount Cemetery is it's a prime example of what we call a garden cemetery. This came at a time in cemetery artwork and funeral practices. Things were changing rapidly. This was a sea change moment and moving away from the older, creepier Puritan ethic where there were a lot of skulls and crossbones into a focus on the spirituality and the idea of the soul going to heaven. And so this cemetery really came about during a time in the movement where people wanted to walk through cemeteries, they wanted to picnic in cemeteries, they wanted a peaceful place to come back to visit their loved ones. So behind me is Black Agnes, the so-called cursed stone of Montpelier. The urban legend is that if you sit on Black Agnes's lap at midnight on a full moon, you'll either die or have some bad luck. And what's really interesting is that there are other Black Agnes statues, very similar to this one across the country. Some people say it's the Virgin Mary, some people say it's Thanos, the god of death. The reality of who's buried here is actually so much different than the folklore. So this is actually the grave of John Hubbard from the Hubbard family, one of the big Montpelier families. And he was actually not well liked in the community. When his aunt, who was very, very wealthy, died, she wanted to leave a bunch of her money to the city. John Hubbard contested the will of his money. He left it almost exactly as his aunt had originally intended. Cemeteries have so much folklore around them, and it's often around someone who dares to disturb the sanctity of the cemetery. I have to walk carefully because there are some people who come here, not for the art, not for the history, but because they have a deep personal connection to someone buried here. Yeah, there's still burials here at the cemetery. And, it was really one of the reasons why this was built is because Montpelier was growing very fast. So this was the place where, Montpelier, especially in the 1800s, the rich, the famous, the powerful families, they were buried here in Greenmount Cemetery. This is Jesus on his deathbed. When this cemetery was built, you died in your home usually, surrounded by family. You weren't in a hospital or hospice. So people, saw the body. So people were much closer to the experience and the process of death. I grew up in New England, and I've lived here my whole life. I hung out in cemeteries a lot. I was a bit of a goth teenager. So I was just always fascinated by cemetery artwork and the mythology they hold for our society as a place where the veil between life and death is thinnest. I've been to probably about 500 cemeteries in Vermont. There's these little secret hidden cemeteries, and actually about half the cemeteries in Vermont are just farm family cemeteries. I realized that there's a kind of a hidden language among gravestone artwork between the artwork itself and the epitaphs and the information about these people delivered, that there's a whole conversation happening among these stones about, what's the meaning of life, why do we die, and what happens to us when we die. So we're here at the gravestone of little Margaret Pitkin. Little Margaret, she died when she was 7 years old in December 1899 of spinal meningitis. The disease took her very quickly, so it was only a few days between her getting ill and her dying, and this was a big shock to her family. And she was apparently really well known in the community as this kind of golden-haired child that everyone loved and everyone knew in the community. The story goes that the family initially refused to pay the bill for the stonework because they said there was a button missing on one of her shoes. The stone carvers actually took the photograph out and showed them that button was missing from her shoe in the photograph itself. This is one of the stones where people come and they, as you can see, they leave pennies. Usually almost every cemetery has some kind of stone that attracts leave-behinds, usually a penny or so. The this idea that we have to recognize that we're all going to die someday. And really, back in early Puritan days, this was a useful message because the people died much younger. Our societies grew up as we became industrialized, as lifespans went longer. You did see that shift away from that message to this more idea of a person being at peace and being in heaven. So Vermont cemeteries are really more reflective of the spiritualism aspect. I've never seen a death's head in Vermont, so if anyone finds one for me, let me know. So we're at the stone of Ned the dog. There is no dog buried here. This is for the only child of the Stevens family, a statue of his favorite pet, of the little bow tie. This is what we call the stairway to heaven. This was all one stone that they carved the stairs from, so it's a particularly, big feat. For me, walking through a cemetery and seeing that continuity of life, it's humbling, especially if you've lived in a community for a while and you might know people or know the names. Visit your local cemetery, walk the aisles, look at the stones, read the names, and begin to, put yourself on that dot of the continuum of life and death.
Gone are the cares of life's busy throng.
I love spending time in cemeteries, and we will get stuck in Vermont with you again real soon. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. Sign up for our weekly email alerts. And I am not sitting on your lap. I'm not even, I know there's videos of me, I'm just like, no.
Yeah.
I don't need to tempt fate.
I'll probably have a cool epitaph. I just don't know what it is yet. So yeah, that's also part of the changes that we're seeing now. Most people that are dying today are being cremated. They're not being buried a hole in a coffin. Death and how you want to be remembered is becoming so much more personalized.